Today the candidates resumed in Russia. 8 of the best chess players on the planet are fighting for a spot to challenge the world champion Magnus Carlsen in the World Championship, which will take place later on this year. Going into the second part of the event, Jan Nepomniachtchi from Russia and Maxime Vachier Lagrave from France were leading the event, with 4 players chasing them 1 point behind. Those players were Fabiano Caruana, Anish Giri, Grishchuk and Wang Hao from China. Every single game is important at this tournament, but today we had some career-defining moments in some clash encounters. The one that I will be covering today is the game between Fabiano Caruana and Maxime Vachier Lagrave. Arguably, one of the most important games of the tournament, at least up to this point. Fabiano Caruana, as I've mentioned, was trailing the leaders by 1 point, and he was playing one of the leaders, Maxime Vachier Lagrave. With a win, he would have caught up with MVL and given himself a real chance of winning this event and challenging Magnus Carlsen in yet another match. In recent times, Fabiano Caruana has played absolutely every single move with white. He plays e4, he plays d4, he plays c4, knight f3, you name it. But of course, his true love remains e4, a move that characterizes his style and his preponderance to play very theoretical lines. And this is exactly what he played in this game. Of course, MVL, we know that against d4, his main weapon is the Grunfeld. Against e4, his main weapon and pretty much everything that he plays and that he played throughout the years has been the Najdorf. Will he prepare something else for the candidates? That was a big question that he had to answer in this game. And we will see what happened. White played e4, c5, knight to f3, d6, d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, knight to f6, knight to c3, and we see a6 on the board. Of course, this characterizes the Najdorf. This is the beginning of Najdorf. White has a lot of options at this point. He can play bishop e3, he can play bishop e2, he can play f3. The usual, though, is the move bishop to g5. This is called the Richter Rouser. It's one of the most aggressive openings in chess, and it creates complete chaos on the board. e6, f4, queen to b6, and this is the beginning of what we call the poison pawn, one of the most theoretical lines in chess. Nevertheless, the poison pawn is considered to be one of the main alternatives and probably the best alternative for black against the Richter Rouser. Everything else seems to be giving white a slight advantage. After queen to b6, though, the theory says that black, with knowledge, with perfect knowledge and perfect play, should be fine. Let's see what happened next. Queen to d2, queen takes b2, rook to b1, queen to a3, e5. White is immediately opening the center and trying to activate his pieces. Not only that, you're attacking the knight and trying to open up the center and the d file, but also you're creating a very important square for your knight to go to e4, a very nice central square for this knight. After the knight from f6 is going to move away. h6, bishop to h4, d takes e5, f takes e5, knight to d7, knight to e4. Now, of course, you don't want to take knight takes e5 because, unfortunately, after moves such as knight takes e6, queen d8 is going to come next, supported by the bishop on h4, and the king on e8 is going to be in deep trouble. You can continue with bishop takes e6. This is just going to be a checkmate on the board, and if you take with the pawn f takes e6, I can simply just take, for example, on c8 and continue the game like this. This is not looking very good for black. But of course, black is not forced to take on e5. The main move is to capture yet another pawn, but on the other side. He played the move queen takes a2. This move queen a2, not only that takes the pawn and gains the tempo by attacking the rook on d1, but at the same time it prepares the queen to come back in the center and defend the d file. White goes rook to d1, increasing the pressure on the d file, just waiting for black to take on e5, open up the d file, and allow white to take on e6 or any sort of discovery move with the knight on d4, and then queen d8 is going to come with a checkmate. Of course, black is not going to take on e5. He plays queen d5. This is still very much theory. Queen goes to e3. Now we're opening up the d file. We're getting ready to go moves such as knight to f5, discovery attacks. Knight to f5 right now could be a threat. Queen takes e5. Black is now how many pawns up? 3 pawns up. That's a lot of pawns. Nevertheless, we see white has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pieces which are already developed. Black only 1, 2 pieces that are already developed, and these 3 pieces are not necessarily playing an active role yet. Let's see what happened. In this moment, this move c3 is not one of the most topical lines. Nevertheless, is still a very, very dangerous alternative for black. Bishop to c5. Another very important move is the move bishop to e7. This is the main alternative to the game continuation. And after bishop takes e7, king takes e7, knight goes to f3. Once again, we see this topical idea of opening up the d file and creating danger around the square d6. Potentially the knight could jump to d6, but also the rook on the d file gets in play. Knight to f3, queen to c7, bishop to e2. White is just simply continuing his development. He's getting ready to go castle, and then not only that, I'm going to have a lot of pressure on the d file, but I'm also going to have a lot of pressure on the f file. Knight to f6, knight to d6, rook to d8, knight to f5, king to f8, and we have some just simply crazy lines in this variation. Rook takes d8, queen takes d8, queen to c5, king g8, queen takes c8, and the position peters out into this endgame, which remains very, very difficult to assess. But this just goes to show how complicated this whole line is, and how much knowledge, theoretical knowledge, both players need to have. Of course, Fabiano Caruana was very well prepared. MVL, I don't know how well prepared was, because at this point Fabiano just uncorked one of the most spectacular opening preparations in recent history, and most likely in the foreseeable future. Bishop to g3, queen to d5, bishop to c4, boom, attacking the queen on d5, just simply forcing the queen to take on c4. Right now white is 1 piece down and 3 pawns. That's huge. That's a huge material deficit. Nevertheless, let's see these pieces come into play. Not anytime soon. White immediately needs to threaten something, and he creates this huge threat of taking on c5, freeing up the d6 square, and that's just going to be a double attack, and the queen will be lost. Black has to immediately take action and try to eliminate the knight on e4, or at least displace the knight on e4. Knight to f6 was played. Knight takes c5, knight f6 is the best move in the position, so MVL was definitely reacting the way he was supposed to react. Very, very well played by MVL as well. Knight to d5, queen to e5, rook to g8, defending the pawn on g7. Of course, this is a very strange configuration of pieces. Look at this, all these pieces on the dark squares. The queen can always take on c3. The problem is that that could potentially displace it from this beautiful square on c4, where it's kind of guarded, and the knights are not going to attack the queen on c4 anytime soon. So black is playing a very good game as well. Knight takes e6, another sacrificial idea by white. White needs to do something. He is still 3 pawns down. If he doesn't do anything immediately, black is just going to continue his development with knight c6, exchange some pieces, and then he's just going to be 3 pawns up and have a decisive advantage. White has to take action immediately. Knight takes c6, f takes c6, knight takes c6, queen takes c3. A very, very good way of dealing with this position would have been knight to f6. But of course, this is such a difficult practical decision to play the move knight to f6, drop back with the knight, get it closer to the king, and allow all sorts of discovery checks. From a practical perspective, knight to f6 is simply an impossible move to make, because At this point, you've been under pressure, under theoretical pressure from Fabiano Caruana, and you just want to simplify the position. You're given the opportunity to take on c3 and exchange the queens. Of course, any player will take that opportunity. Knight to f6 would have been an inhuman approach by black, and not something that I can hold against MVL that he didn't find. Queen takes c3, queen takes c3 was played, knight takes c3, knight to c7, king to f7, rook to d3, attacking the knight on c3, knight to e4. In this position, after knight to e4, white already has quite a significant advantage. The equalizing move for black in this position would have been rook to a7. Rook to a7 is a very natural move. The problem is that if you do not see the follow-up, then it's just simply impossible to play this move. Because after castle, king to g6, rook takes c3, in this position, the only move that equalizes is this crazy move, king to h7. I'm just trying to shield my king away from a potential knight attack via knight to d5, knight to e7. And this is key. For example, a very natural move in this position to try to free up the rook would be to play the move b5. This allows knight to d5, which is going to simply attack this move knight to e7, and you cannot safeguard all the pieces at the same time. So right now, white is just simply winning. Of course, all of this is extremely difficult to see from afar, and the natural response in this position is, of course, to play the move knight to e4, which was played in the game. Castle, king to g6, knight takes a8, and now we see the imbalance in the position. White has an exchange up for 2 pawns. Black normally, under normal circumstances, should be okay, should be very close to equalizing in this game. But unfortunately, the king on g6 still remains very much out of play, and that's going to play a huge part in the remaining of the game. Knight c6, knight to b6, rook to d8, knight takes c8, rook takes c8, bishop to a3, and now the rooks in coordination with the bishop are going to create devastating attacks. For example, bishop will come to b2. I'm going to attack the bishop on the pawn on g7. Potentially rook to d7. Attacking these 2 pawns is going to be just simply devastating. The position is very, very difficult for black, and at this point MVL already was quite low on time. Rook to c7, defending the 7th rank, a very good move. Rook to f4, knight to f6, bishop to b2. White is doing exactly what he's supposed to do. He's attacking the knight on f6 and potentially going to disrupt the pawn structure on the king side. Knight to e7, bishop takes f6 has to be played. You cannot allow the knights to connect at this point with knight d5. The knights connected would be a tremendous force for black and most likely would allow him to equalize. Now, bishop takes f6, g takes f6, h4. This is considered to be quite a bad move by the endgame specialists, let's say, because pawns simply cannot move back, and you're allowing black to get a target in this pawn on h4. This knight on f5 will no longer be able to be kicked out via the move g4, h3 and g4. Now after h4, black plays the move h5, which is a very good move, stabilizing the pawn structure and getting ready to put the knight on f5 and attack this pawn on h4. Rook to g3, immediately kicking the king away. Rook to g5 is the follow-up that Fabiano Caruana calculated. Of course, it looks as if black is just going to lose this pawn on h5, but after the move rook to c1, king to h2, knight to g6, rook to f2, now I'm going to be able to exchange the h-pawns, and that is going to allow black to equalize the position, theoretically equalize the position. This, in theory, is going to be a draw starting from now. Unfortunately, theory and practice are not the same thing. So let's see what happened in the remainder of the game. Rook takes h5, knight to g6, rook h7, king e6, rook takes b7. I'm starting to pick up the pawns on the queen side. These pawns, disconnected past pawns, looked very threatening. unfortunately, you don't have enough pieces to support them. And my rooks are just going to be extremely aggressive, coupling attacks against the black king on e6, as well as the pawns on the queen side. You're going to be unable to defend everything. Best you can do, and this is exactly what black did, is to exchange a pair of rooks in the process. Knight to e5, a very good understanding by MVL, rook to b6, rook to c6, rook takes c6, knight takes c6, and now we have this position. The a pawn is going to fall, and then the question is, with the knight on e5, the pawn on f6, and the king on g6, will black have a blockade? Let's see. Rook to c2, knight to b4, rook to d2, knight to c6. We're going to shuffle the pieces a little bit, try to create some problems on the clock for MVL. That's exactly what Fabiano was doing. MVL was in time trouble, and he had to find the right way to position his pieces to create that blockade. King to f4, king to g6, rook to d6. MVL decides to stop worrying about the pawn on a6, knight to e5 instead of knight to b4, of course, which have prolonged the suffering of the pawn on a6, but ultimately this pawn on a6 would have fallen. And you also do not want to venture with the knight too far away from your king, because for example, after knight to b4, I can just simply play the move king to e4, control the knight, and this knight, unfortunately, I don't think is going to be very easy to get it back to the desired defensive square on e5. So a much safer way of black continuing was, of course, the move knight to e5, rook takes a6, knight to f7, king to e4, knight to h6, rook to a5, knight to f7. And now the question is, how are we going to break black's blockade? Of course, we have to relocate this king from g6 so that my king can enter via f5. And the only way to do that is via the g file. So Fabiano understands that. He plays the move rook to a3. Knight to d6, king to f4, knight to f5, rook to d3, and this is the critical moment in the position. And this is something that, if you guys will decide to analyze this endgame, if you guys will decide to understand this endgame and understand how to defend it in the future, if you ever encounter this in your own games, never play the next move. Never put the knight on the square that MVL put his knight to, and that is knight to h6. Knight on the rim is dim, and this in this situation, this is exactly the case. A much better move, and not the only move, but a much better move and an easy way to remember is you need to keep your knights on these three squares: f5, g7, e6. These are the critical squares in the position. So black in this position was supposed to play the move knight to g7. This looks a bit awkward, of course. That g7 square doesn't look very pretty, but at the same time, the knight is ready to jump either to e6, either to f5, which is crucial to the defense of this position. After a move such as rook g3, king to f7, king to e4, my knight goes to e6, so the knight has to stay on these three squares. King to d5, knight to f4. Now that the king goes via the d6, you can go knight to f4. In this position, you can also go knight to g7, which also maintains equality. Knight to f4, king d6, knight to h5. Again, I'm not away from the g7 square, which is the critical transition square for the knight. Very, very important square. You guys should keep this in mind for the future. King to d5, knight to f5, and white is simply unable to make any progress. Let's go back to our game. The move knight to h6, a huge mistake, which just simply loses the game. After rook to g3, now the king and knight are separated, and the knight is unable to return to the critical defensive square g7. King to e4, knight to g8, king to f5, knight to g7, king to f4, knight to d5, king to g4, king to g6, king to f3. White is shuffling the pieces a little bit. King to e7, king to e4, knight to e7, king to f4, knight to d5, king to f5, knight to e7, king to e4, and now black is simply in Suzwang. You can no longer play the move knight to d5. You can no longer, well, you can play the move knight to g6. The problem with this move is that at this point, I'm just simply going to shuffle my rook on the other side, and this is the type of position, the pressure on the 7th rank, you cannot be caught like this. If you are caught in this position and the king is forced to go on this side, on e6 instead of this side, on g6, now this position is just simply winning very, very easily for white. I'm just simply going to bring the king all the way to h6, I'm going to put the pawn on g4, and then I'm going to put you in Zugzwang. For example, I can play the move king to f4, king to f7, king to g6. You notice that due to the fact that this pin on the 7th rank is so powerful, black cannot play the move king to g6. If you go king to f8, I'm just simply going to go king to h6. It's the same thing. My king is invariably going to go to h6 and is going to invade via g7. King to f7, king to h6, king to e6, and now very important is to put the pawn on g4 so that we take away this f5 square for the knight. King to g7 is going to come next. For example, you can play a move such as knight to d5, king to g7, and the main idea in the position is that if you try to play a move such as king to e5, now I'm just simply going to go rook to a5, pin the knight, sacrifice the exchange for the knight, and now after king to f6, the position is just simply winning. The pawn is going to go and promote. So, after king to e4, black played the move knight to g8. We're returning to the game. Rook to h3. Once again, this knight is never coming back on either f5, e6, or g7. At least not without big repercussions. King to g6, rook to a3, king to f7, king to f4, knight to h6, rook to g3, knight to g8, king to g4, knight to e7, king to h5, and finally the king is getting ready to invade via the h file. Knight to d5, rook to f3, king to e6, g4, a very important move, controlling the f5 square for the knight. Impeccable understanding by Fabiano Caruana. King to e5, king to g6, and black just simply resigned because, as I mentioned, this is a big threat. Rook to f5, followed by rook takes d5, sacrifice the exchange for the knight, take the pawn on f6, and my pawn is going to promote. An impeccable game by Fabiano Caruana, an incredible opening preparation by Fabiano Caruana. MVL played the Najdorf, took the risk of being caught in the opening. We have seen MVL suffer in both of his most played openings. That is, of course, the Grunfeld and the Najdorf. He got caught in the Najdorf. He needs to change something. He trusts this opening a little bit too much and he's suffering because of that. Fabiano Caruana, though, is back on track. He's only half a point behind the leader, Jan Nepomniachtchi, who drew his game against Anish Giri. And right now, we have a tournament on our hands. It's going to be a very tight race between Fabiano Caruana, Anish Giri, Jan Nepomniachtchi, and of course, MVL is still in contention. Grishchuk lost his game, so he's kind of out of contention. Fabiano Caruana is ready to make a run for that coveted candidate's title. He's in prime position to secure another match against Magnus Carlsen. He's in amazing shape. He's playing simply like a machine, and it's going to be very exciting to see what the next rounds have in store for us. If you like the video, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps us grow the channel. It really helps me put more content for you guys. Give me the feedback in the comments, and I will see you guys next time. See you tomorrow.